Hello, everybody. It's me, Teresa Chan again, Assistant Dean for the Program for Faculty Development. I am delighted to have a panel of speakers here with me today to talk about collaborative writing. And so I have some people that I've been writing with collaboratively, some for months and some for years. And so I would like to introduce them. So first is Mary Haas. Maybe Mary can turn her video on and jump in and wave hi. So Mary, do you want to tell everyone a little bit about yourself, where you're at?
Oh yeah, sounds great. I'm coming to you from Ann Arbor, Michigan. I am one of the assistant program directors at the University of Michigan Emergency Medicine Residency. And I have an interest in social media and education, communities of practice, and have had the pleasure of doing some collaborative writing with the people leading this session. So it's a pleasure to be here.
Great. And next, we will put the spotlight on Dr. Michael Gottlieb. So Mike, do you want to take it away and introduce yourself?
Yeah, thanks for having me. Excited to speak with you all over the next roughly 45 minutes. So my name is Mike Gottlieb. I am an associate professor, the ultrasound division director, and the ultrasound fellowship director at Rush University Medical Center in Chicago. I am also an emergency physician, and I've been collaborating with several of these team members for quite a while. I actually was collaborating with Teresa Chan for almost a year before I actually ever met her. Through online collaborations, we developed a program together before we'd actually met. So it's a testament to the value of collaboration over online medium.
There was a lot of Google Hangouts, I think, before we met in person. And I felt like I already knew you by the time I met you in real life for the first time. So testament to that technological jump that we can make for sure. And I think some of you will know, but this is the famous Dr. Yusuf Yilmaz, who's a postdoctoral fellow here at McMaster. Yusuf, do you want to tell us a little bit about yourself and your background again?
Thank you for having me again here on this session. I'm Yusuf. I'm a postdoctoral fellow at Merit, McMaster University Education Research Innovation and Theory Unit. And I've been working with Dr. Chan 10 months now, like starting from the 1st of September. But I've been knowing her from Twitter before I wrote her. So kind of like collaboration was started on Twitter and then moved to just like doing my postdoc here with her. So it's kind of good story for me here.
Excellent. So we're going to stop the spotlight and we're going to bounce around a little bit. So I'm going to start a little bit with my own reflections, and then I'm going to ask everyone to kind of reflect on their own as well about the art of collaboration. So for me, one of the beautiful things about writing collaboratively rather than taking kind of like a serial approach is that you don't have to feel so lonely anymore when you're writing. So you don't have to feel like as the first author, you have to bear the burden of actually putting it all together and then having this masterpiece before you send it to your co-authors. What I've found is that using collaborative writing techniques such as Google Docs, or even just a shared Dropbox folder where you take turns, you can check in with your authors more often. And I think that, to be honest, with the ICMJE criteria, help everyone meets the authorship criteria more rigorously. I think that, not that I like to police who's been involved in the paper, but I do find that like sometimes in big collaborations, it's hard to tell who wrote what. And Google Docs definitely, as you might have seen in the other video that we did earlier, it allows you to kind of track that and see who's contributed and who's disagreed with whom and try to iron that out. So I think that that's really nice. And I think that in today's day and age where we're trying to be ethical about our involvement as authors and make sure that we adhere to the international consensus of medical journal editors, so ICMJE have criteria about what makes you an author, I think it's really nice to have some of these digital tools to allow for that kind of tracking. The other thing that I like it for is that when you share it with people to their Gmail or other kind of affiliated accounts, you can actually, I guess John Sherman is one of my colleagues and he's called me out on it. He's said that at times what happens is that you can kind of gamify or I guess reinforce positive behavior in writing. So for instance, if Mike, Mary, and I are all writing a paper together, when Yusuf is involved as well, and he goes and edits 32 things, all of us get a push notification from Google that says, hey, Yusuf's been working really hard on this paper. And the likelihood of me clicking in to take a look at what Yusuf's done and also maybe contributing myself is higher as well. So I think that it actually encourages that kind of collaboration and hands-on approach so that people aren't kind of like off on their own. So with that, I'd like to kind of pivot over to Mary and have her kind of talk about some of the ins and outs that she's had.
Thank you. Yes, I think one of the things that I've loved most about the remote collaborative writing experience is that it's given me the opportunity to connect with people outside of my institution. I have great mentors and connections here at the University of Michigan, but there's something that's been really special about being able to learn from people at completely different environments who have a different working culture and have learned totally different strategies and leadership skills that I maybe haven't been exposed to within my own little microcosm. So even just through the remote writing experiences I've had with the team members leading the session, for instance, the authorship grid was a tool that I learned from Dr. Chan, and that's the table that we saw on Yusuf's template there. You could see he had the table where everybody filled out their name and institution and Twitter handle, and that was just like blew my mind, because one of the biggest roadblocks in traditional writing I've found is that end stage, just getting everybody's authorship information. It takes people forever to respond to you, and then all you're waiting on is to make sure that you have their spelling and their degree and everything correctly, and just putting that out there up front in the Google Doc was such a beautiful, simple solution to that. So that's just one example of how I have learned through the process of being able to work with people outside of my institution. And I think the social experience is so amazing. When I reflect back on some of the papers that I've had the biggest challenges with, or that have felt the hardest to write, it's because I really felt the full burden. And for some reason that made me more likely to procrastinate. But that positive peer pressure aspect that Dr. Chan was talking about is just so valuable. When you see other people on the team getting work done and being productive and contributing, it makes you want to do the same thing, versus it's so easy, you know, in traditional writing to just stall when if the first author gets busy and they haven't had bandwidth to move along the paper just kind of, you know, hits that roadblock. But this way, people on the team are much more engaged and more invested and moving it forward. So those are some of the things that I've really appreciated about the experience.
All right, I'm gonna toss it over to Dr. Gottlieb now to share his insights as well.
Yeah, I'll echo some of Mary's and Teresa's really great points. Is that, you know, you broaden the idea of just broadening your network. I think no matter how much great mentorship you have at your own institution, there's so much more out there that you can be exposed to, and so many more opportunities to learn from other people, you know, both from a style standpoint as well as just expansion of knowledge of ideas that we would never have thought of. That when you get a group of people together, you're able to identify these really great future projects that you would never have thought of individually. And I think that team component of it is such a really, really great way of really creating much more powerful projects that are much more impactful in the literature. One of the other things I really enjoy about this collaborative writing style is that, you know, our schedules are pretty busy. And I think when you try to get 5 or 6 or 7 people together, you know, I think we've all done those doodle polls where there's one option that sort of works. And even then it's like one person misses it. And it's impossible to get everyone together in the same thing. So you start a project like 4 months later because you have to plan something where everyone can reserve off one Monday at 3 p.m. And then something always happens. And these projects that are usually stalled off for infinity can then be done much quicker because we can work asynchronously. And we'll probably talk about this a little bit later, but you can use platforms like Slack or Microsoft Teams or different, you know, models to allow people to, you know, add comments at whatever time works best for you. So if as I mentioned, I'm an emergency physician, and so I'm working sometimes overnight. And as a result, I probably won't be able to respond to something at like 7 p.m. if I'm working at, you know, in the ED at the time. But I can respond at 3 a.m. and not wake everyone up, but instead I can just add my comments, and then when someone wakes up at 7 a.m., they can add upon that. So it kind of works around everyone's schedules, regardless of how busy or erratic the schedules are.
That's great. Yusuf, do you want to add your thoughts here? You have to unmute yourself. I'm sorry.
So my Zoom is just giving me the warning, but I'm just ignoring it. Okay. So what I want to find nice about the Google Docs, like they give you the option to assign the different sections with the comment bubbles, and then they will just get notified like, and they will just like assign to that section. So in these regular cases, like you will send them to emails like, okay, can you write some introduction paragraphs, or can you do the method section? But here you will just talk about the context, the contextual base. So when you click something on the methods part and then highlight it and make some comment on it, and then you will be able to just assign some people, okay, can you finish it? Or you can even discuss on the comment bubble. So you will have just like get this sorted out throughout the papers, and they will just always update it about the information. And you if you are working in the 3 a.m. and then you will be just doing on your part as well.
Yeah. And that brings up a good point, right? Like you can have disagreements sometimes. So I think, Mary, we've had papers where maybe everyone didn't see eye to eye. And so do you want to join me in reflecting on how we actually overcame that? Because I think that's important too, right? Like not everything's all sunshines and rainbows just because you have a Google Doc, right? Like sometimes you don't get along, and sometimes it's,
Yes.
yeah.
Thank you for bringing up this important topic. I was telling you, my psychiatrist friend just visited me today, and we were kind of reflecting on academics because she recently completed a fellowship and went to work in the community. And I asked her, I was like, do you ever miss academics? And she was like, no, wait, too much drama. Yeah, I mean, I hadn't thought of it that way, but there's kind of a lot of drama in academics. I mean, sometimes, people have different perspectives. Everybody's really intelligent and smart, and everybody has a valuable perspective. It just may be different. And sometimes people have egos. And you maybe are doing everything remotely where you lose, the nuances of reading somebody's facial expressions and tones with text-based communication. So, and if you're trying to get something done quickly, which, our teams, we like to move things quickly and get them done. It's just like a setup sometimes for conflict. And so that experience that Dr. Chan was referring to, even though it was a little dramatic and challenging and a little bit emotional at the time, it was actually an amazing learning experience because conflict is inevitable. And even if you're somebody like me who doesn't like it, you're going to eventually find yourself in the middle of it and have to deal with it. And I think the most valuable lesson for me that I'll take moving forward when I encounter conflict in collaborative writing teams is to take it to an in-person or Zoom or phone conversation, take it off the text-based platform. And have a meaningful conversation, because you're much more likely to, be able to understand each other's tone of voice, meet halfway, recognize that both of you have good intentions when you're having more of a face-to-face voice conversation than a text. And usually when there's conflict, it's good to just kind of acknowledge it and be like, hey, let's pause. Let's talk through this on a Zoom call and work through it and strategize moving forward. And sometimes you need to adapt your strategy to make everybody on the team comfortable. And then the second point is just to reflect on who you work well with. If you're part of a team that wants to move fast and you have other people who are more methodical and want to take time and, review it thoroughly and everybody have an equal part, you may not see eye to eye. So kind of setting expectations at the beginning about your timelines and making sure everybody's on board with that can help from the preventative side of conflict.
Yeah, and I think that what Mike was reflecting on earlier about like getting a doodle poll out to find a time when everyone can meet. Sometimes you might not need to do that at the beginning, but it might be when you've had 17 million comments in the margin, and there's a back and forth between Yusuf and Mike, and they're just disagreeing. It might be time for the rest of the authorship pool to go, hey, why don't you two go and do a Google Hangout and resolve this and get back to us, or we do it as a big team. So it really depends on how you want to work your team, right? Because there's a good amount of leadership there too. So with that in mind, I'm going to pivot to Mike and I invite him to kind of speak about leading teams, because I think that, I've been on your teams before, Mike. I'd do it again anytime. So maybe you can kind of go through kind of the process of what this looks like when you're the one leading a collaborative writing team. What are some things and steps that you take?
Sure. So thank you, Dr. Chan. When we're looking at teams, I think everyone has their own slight different variations of how they like to run teams, and some of it's relying with their personality. So I will lend how I like to do it, but with the caveat that, everyone runs teams a little bit differently. I think one of the probably hallmark features of when you're running a team is just discussing your goals and timelines early. So establishing, okay, this is what our goals are. This is what we'd like to accomplish. This is what people are going to do. And this is when we'd like to have it done by. And I try to dissect out pieces. So rather than saying, let's aim to have our paper done by, July 25th. I'll say, okay, so we have several parts of this paper, and I'll break out each step into a timeline. So, all right, here's for example, we'd like to have the outline done by a week from now. And in another 2 weeks, we'd like to aim to have kind of the lit search done. Another 2 weeks from then, we'll do the writing piece. And so each piece builds on itself. So it's a little bit more bite-sized, which at least for me is often a little easier to, tackle. Okay, I can do an outline, but to say I have to do this whole paper in, 2 months seems overwhelming. But to say I have to do an outline a week is much more manageable. And so kind of creating these bite-sized pieces and then communicating with the team and saying, all right, does this work for you? I mean, my schedule in July is probably not quite as busy as a program director or as an APD. And so that's going to influence things. And so, for example, on my end, I'm like, well, I'm core faculty, so I have a couple of things I have to do, but not probably the same level as Dr. Haas, where she's going to be incredibly busy at that time. And being cognizant that, these times of year affect people different ways, and checking with the team, making sure those deadlines work. When I'm running a team, I like to, along those lines, I like to give people an outline. Okay, here's what I'd like you to do. And I'll provide an example because my vision may not match their vision. So it's nice to know what my vision is and let them see what I'm looking for, but it prevents me from, or at least limits my, micromanaging of it. So I'm not telling them, okay, we're going to do this exactly this way, because there's multiple ways to get to an end product. But if you know what the end looks like, it's easier to get there, even if you're going to take your own pathway. So I try to give them examples of where I want to go without necessarily forcing them to follow my exact pathway. One of the other things I found really helpful is creating dyads. And so oftentimes we'll have a bigger team of, somewhere between 5 to maybe 9 or 10 people. And we have 4 sections of a paper. So for each of those, I'll assign basically like 2 people to work together. And I try to pair it where I have like a more junior person and a more senior person. So the junior person gets the opportunity to do a little more writing, but they have direct, targeted mentorship and each step along the way. So there's more frequent check-ins that are built into that. They have the opportunity to learn. It creates, if they haven't worked together before, a new mentorship model, and hopefully identifies a new mentor for them. And then that dyad team will then check in with the bigger team. So it creates a little more direct mentorship, and that seemed to work pretty well from projects I've done. So I think those are some of the things I found to be most effective from a teaming standpoint.
Yeah, those are really good tips. And I think that what you do really well, and that you probably didn't even think that you do, is that you set a very psychologically safe environment for people to speak up and object. Like you make it, hey, would that work for everyone? Like, can everyone confirm that this is going to be okay for them? You make it so that people don't feel like they're being pressured. Like, I think that you've even said things like, there's no timeline other than the one we set forth. And those are kind of really powerful phrases to use when you're leading a team of asynchronous writers, because as much as sometimes when everybody's working on stuff, someone's like, I just had a baby and like I'm on mat leave right now, and all of these pressures build up, or they have like 6 kids they're trying to homeschool right now during COVID. Each of those things is going to be slightly different, right? Whether you're male, female, young, old, it really doesn't matter. Being able to be a good teammate to your colleagues and friends as you're trying to marshal them through a paper, I think it's about empathy. It's about creating that space for them to tell you what they need. And I have even had authors where I've invited them to reconsider what their job is, because maybe we can save them for later. Like something comes up, that's great. Why don't we swap out? I'll write your section. Why don't you do the hard edit at the end to give us that unified voice? And they're like, oh, when's that going to be? I'm like, probably a month from now. And they can do it then, right? So I think that there are things that come up, and being able to have that open communication back and forth with your colleagues is a key to success. Now, there was one question that came up in the comments, and the idea of how do you address unequal contributions by writers? So how do you guys do that? Like, I'll kind of point at maybe Mary. What are your thoughts? How do you think through that?
I become angry and passive aggressive.
Well, at least you're honest.
It's so challenging. Actually that's kind of what I did the first time that I encountered this situation. Sure. And more recently, now that I've been writing a little bit more, I will nudge them gently, and I'll say, hey, and I'll give them some sort of timeline. If I'm leading the team, I'll say, hey, do you think we could plan on this timeline to complete this task? And if they miss that, I'll kind of do it again. And if they miss that again, then I'll check in with them and make sure that there's nothing else going on. Because I think if somebody's not contributing, before you get angry or resentful, you need to first assume the best intentions and make sure they're okay. Because a lot of times people have other things going on in their life, and completing this paper may not be their number one priority. And if it's a pattern of behavior that doesn't seem like it's just isolated to a particular situation they're experiencing, then I'll often reach out, and I become a lot less shy about suggesting changes in authorship order. Like if it's somebody who's one of the core, the first, the second, or the last author who's not really pulling their weight in the way that we outlined in the beginning team expectations, I'll say, hey, these deadlines have passed. I haven't really been able to hear from you about what's going on. If I don't hear from you, I'll plan to complete the paper and move you to a middle author position or something like that. I think it's always better to try to have a conversation verbally if you can before doing it via email that way, but sometimes people just ghost you. They just don't respond. And so in that case, sometimes that's your only option in terms of getting a hold of them. But I'd be curious. It's hard. I definitely don't feel like I am a pro at this. I'm still learning. These team dynamics can get super tricky, especially when you have a continued clinical or other professional relationship with somebody that you have to continue to work with them. So I don't know if you guys have other strategies. I would love to hear them too.
Well, I mean, I think you kind of snuck one in there without actually calling it out, which is that like having that awkward conversation at the beginning. I joke about it being the academic prenup, right? Before we get into this paper together. We're not getting into bed, we're not getting married, but we're kind of forming a new relationship. Like, let's have that awkward conversation, right? Because just like, like if, back when I was dating, the idea was like, where is this going? That's okay for dating. But in a paper, first author, last author, second author, like you said, Mary, these things actually have academic merit and weight and ramifications for people's careers. And so I think that having that prenup equivalent conversation, like the pre-paper conversation, to say, what are the jobs here? And then who's doing what? And having expectations for those titled kind of like positions, I think is really important, right? So like for instance, at my shop, second author doesn't really carry that much weight. So if I'm second, I might as well be somewhere in the middle. I know in Yusuf's environment back in Turkey, first author or nothing, right? Like it's a very different environment there. So every institution, every discipline has a different code of conduct. So having that conversation up front will save a lot of heartache. And so being able to have an upright conversation, I think the grid actually helps with that, because then people have to actually write themselves in where they think they fit. And sometimes for that same grid that Yusuf showed, I'd actually put down first author, like kind of like just some nudging comments as to we'll do this, we'll do that. And it's like in terms of reference. So if you're signing up there, like you're putting your name after with all these accountabilities, and often that authorship box remains kind of blank, not surprisingly, because it's actually quite a hefty lift, right? And so I think that that's important to think about. And it's often with some of the papers and the research projects I'll be working on, that's already kind of decided who the first and probably the last author is, right? Like whoever the senior author, the supervising person, the mentor, the guide. But as I evolved in my writing, and I have mentees who have become peers, then that definitely is something that can change, right? So Gottlieb's come a long way, and when we were starting, like it was pretty obvious that I was mentoring him. Now I would say that he flips that table regularly, and so we have to have that conversation, because who's gonna be first, who's gonna be last? It's kind of like who's on first conversation. Like like you don't want to get too confusing, but you do want to have that conversation. So Mike, do you have any thoughts, or Yusuf?
Sometimes like even though you nudge them, you try to talk about their contribution to the paper. Sometimes they just not interested in it, but they want to be in it. So in this case, there's a conflict for the ICGME criteria. So they have some contribution, but they don't continue with that. So do you consider to removing authors from the author list or just putting them to the acknowledgement part? Like, what are the best strategies to deal with the like unresponsive authors, co-authors in this case?
Yeah, the ghosting authors. Yeah. And okay, so Mike, I'm going to ask you to try that one out, and then Antonia, if you have a question or you have a comment, we'll come to you next. All right.
Oh, you gave me the hardest one. All right,
Oh.
challenge accepted.
Yeah.
Yeah, I think that is a really difficult situation. In general, calling back to the other, point that Dr. Haas mentioned earlier is just you have to talk to the person, and I think it can get lost in email. It can get lost in Slack channels. It's talking to the person, saying, "Here's where we're at. Here's what everyone else has done." And I try to frame it that way to give a little bit of the peer pressure of like, this is the amount that everyone else has done. To satisfy ICJME, and that's actually nice. It's out there that I can say, okay, this is what they expect of an author. What can we do to bring that in? How about with this piece? Can you maybe do, massive, as I think Dr. Chan mentioned earlier, can you do some, massive as to maintain a voice? And then it's something where they may feel more comfortable in that role, especially I think with senior authors, that can be challenging because they may not, they're going to both be a power differential at times, or there may just be the challenges of trying to get them to do something they don't feel like is at their level, which, we could talk about whether that's true, but they may feel that way. And I think that we have to be conscious of that piece. So maybe giving something that may feel a more appropriate task to them that utilizes their skill set to the best ability. So if they're really, knowledgeable in the field, maybe they can bring that knowledge in and help buff up references and come up with a more in-depth discussion. They may feel more appropriate doing, but I think it has to be that conversation.
Yeah.
I'm also very interested to see how you all approach this.
I'm going to go to Antonia because this is such a hard question. We will take any answers we can have from the floor, of course, as well. Yeah. Antonia, do you want to?
Of a question sort of along the same line. What do you guys think about courtesy authors?
All right. I think what I heard, this is what I'm going to reverse engineer, is that she's asking about honorary authorship or courtesy authorship. And so I think the ICMJE criteria, which we'll post in the show notes when we actually put this up on the web, but also they're just searchable. So if you want to just Google it right now, they are pretty well-defined criteria that outline what it means to be an author. And people who meet partial parts of those criteria, like they don't actually meet all of criteria 1, which is like contributing the idea, gathering data, that kind of like substantively kind of contribute to the doing of the research. As criteria 2 is like being able to write and actually have participation in writing of the manuscript. And then the last phase is actually final approval. So that's definitely the 3 kind of phases of things. A final approval and sign off on like standing behind the paper. Like, so if it gets retracted and you're going through the surgisphere kind of debacle, you would have actually sat up for it. So I do think that that idea of the honorary authorship is definitely something that's going by the wayside with the advent of the ICMJE criteria. And to be honest, those are relatively new. They're like a new technology right now in the world. And so having a conversation with people who are more senior that didn't come up in that era is hard. But I think that where we flip it is we actually do better by our junior colleagues than has been done to us. And we actually just start working, following it through in a good way going forward. And so if you're a junior person, there might be an expectation, and I would explore judiciously with your mentors how best to handle something. I've heard all sorts of atrocious stories of like chairs bullying their way into papers, or very senior people being that way. Unfortunately, I know those things happen, and those people would probably be the same to say, oh no, that would never happen on my watch. And yet sometimes that can be the case. One of the things I do commonly notice is that junior authors sometimes don't appreciate the way that the senior people might have contributed. because they come along a different phase of the study. Maybe they didn't realize that it took 5 years to secure the funding, and now they're a PhD student and they're like, well, that person never did anything. They might not appreciate the whole story. So having that prenup conversation, talking through the criteria, making sure people understand what everyone else has done is actually a really big part of it. And so have I written in the margin comment, I'm like, I'm not sure what this person has done, but hopefully they can take a look at the paper and make some suggestions would be good. The other thing that I've done actually is actually booked time with someone that's maybe more senior, realized that actually, and this is something that Mary had said that maybe we should bring up, there was a tech barrier. And that's why they hadn't edited the Google Doc. And so what I'll do is I'll like Zoom with them, I'll screen share, and then we'll just go through the paper together. And so sometimes it's about creating whatever way to be as equitable and accessible as possible to include everyone, and being mindfully inclusive can be really important. There are some people that are better editors and don't want to write a first draft. There are some people that only want to write a first draft and they hate editing. You know what? Once you understand who the people are and their roles, you can better moneyball your team together, right? And so I know several people that I've written many, many papers with. They abhor that first writing part, but they are wonderful editors. And when I send them something, they will redline the entire document to the point where I can't see straight anymore within what's track changes and what's not. And that's interesting because for some reason they can't get over the blank flashing cursor, but they can basically rewrite the paper for me, which is amazing, right? So I think everybody's got different superpowers. And so when you're assembling your team, I think, again, like Mary said, make sure that you have the diagnosis right. So make sure that you're calling a spade, and that this person doesn't have a mental health issue, a crisis at home, other things that are prioritizing other grants. Maybe they're interviewing lots of people for residency programs. Maybe they've got something going on in their lives. Like I said, those are first diagnoses of the exclusion. And then the fact that they're kind of like, quote unquote lazy may also, just the same way that when you have a resident or a med student or a nursing student at risk, the assumption shouldn't be that there's something wrong with them. Most of the people that are in academia still are there because they're gluttons for punishment and they like this kind of work. And so trying to figure out what it is that they want to accomplish and how they saw themselves fitting in their team is important. So you can head it off at the pass with their first conversation, and that you can revise the authorship agreement and try to figure out. And most people will acknowledge, yeah, I didn't contribute as much. I'd like to step up. Here's what I could do. Time just got away from me, yada, yada, yada. I think that's an okay conversation to have. And then I think as you, as a lead author, either as a first or last author, depending on the situation, your job is to try to find a way to get them involved again. And I think that takes some negotiating. But welcome to academia, I guess.
Welcome to the drama.
Yeah, exactly. And again, like sometimes you'll be in a situation, like especially if you're very junior, right? Looking at Yusuf, he'll be in a very different situation than me, who's assistant dean right now. When we walk into a paper, I can say certain things that Yusuf might not be able to some of his senior colleagues, and acknowledging that power dynamic exists, and knowing that as a junior person, you will just sometimes learn through negative role modeling as much as positive role modeling, that I'm never going to do that to someone else. And so the real rubber meets the road is that, yes, ghost authoring or courtesy authoring or honorary authorship shouldn't happen. Does it still happen? Of course it does. Is it because the ICMJ criteria are relatively new and we haven't done a lot of fact dev around it? Probably, partly. Are there practices in academia that pre-existed that and people are still beholden to them? 100%. And I think that's why we're trying to do this like Scholar of the Secrets series, so that we can actually bring to surface some of these controversies. I'll also be posting a link to something that we did a couple of years ago, actually, on the honorary authorship phenomenon. We did a medic series, a medical education in cases series. It's like a little workbook that basically works you through a vignette and then some discussion points and some write-ups and some hints from people who have handled this before. So I'll put that in the show notes as well. as another thing that we can have as a resource. So maybe you want to get out that resource and actually do a little small group session with your lab so that you can have that conversation of what is an honorary authorship? Should it even exist? I love it when there are some junior authors that don't even know what that term means. I'm like so excited because it means that they've never encountered it and they've never been subjugated to it and they've never felt unfairly burdened. And to me, that is the way that we flip the switch. That's how we change the fabric of how we do business, is that we do better for our junior people than has been done to us.